My name is Blake Kimsey. I'm the Executive Director of Writing Workshops Dallas. You probably came to us through writingworkshops.com, or you maybe saw a tweet from Matt Bell about tonight. But however you found us, I'm really happy that you're here. I'm really excited as an aspiring writer myself to get to listen to Matt talk about his book, Refuse to be Done. And you probably all are maybe follow Matt on Twitter, or you've read Appleseed or one of his other books, but Matt is the author most recently of the novel Appleseed, which was a New York Times notable book published by Custom House this past July. And his craft book, which we're here to discuss tonight, Refuse to be Done, is a guide to novel writing, rewriting, and revision from Soho Press that is in its fourth or fifth printing, which is really incredible. He's also the author of the novels Scrapper and In the House Upon the Dirt Between the Lake and the Woods, as well as the short story collection A Tree or a Person or a Wall. Excuse me. And his writing has appeared widely. The New York Times, Esquire, Tin House, Fairy Tale Review, American Short Fiction, and many other publications. He's a native of Michigan, and he teaches creative writing at Arizona State University. We're really happy to have you here tonight, Matt. Thank you for making the time on your book tour. And I'm going to make you the host now, and we'll let you take it from here.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. It's really nice to see all your faces for those who are on camera. It makes me feel like I'm talking to an audience. So I really appreciate that. I'm going to share a PowerPoint in a minute so that you don't have to look at my face the whole time. That will hopefully also make it a little easier to hear and follow along as we go. So let me go ahead and do that real quick, and we will get started. All right. All right, does that look good? We're on screen? Great, thank you, appreciate it. Let me just pull the chat back up so I can see that while I'm talking. All right, okay, so thank you so much for being here to talk about Refuse to be Done. This book began as a lecture and eventually, of course, became this craft book. And so it's really nice to get to give the lecture version of it again. We're going to talk today about the process of writing a novel from sort of beginning to end, really through a lens of revision and rewriting.
Amazon, it's really beautiful. I love it.
And yeah, if you're not muted, if you could please mute, that would be super helpful for me. It's hard for me to stomp the mutes while I'm talking. So please, if you can, I'd appreciate it. Most of the tactics I'm going to talk about today will also apply to memoir, creative nonfiction, and short stories, just at different, sort of sizes and applications. But I hope whatever you're writing, that this will be useful to you. And I also want to say that nothing I'll suggest is meant to be prescriptive or to say there's only one way to write a novel. This book is really, in some ways, a capture of my own novel writing process. This is the way that I do it and the way that I've sort of teach it when I teach novel writing classes. But I hope anything that doesn't sound useful that you will feel free to just discard. And I'll also say that you can feel free to comment or ask questions as we go in the chat. I can sort of see it out of the corner of my eye. If there's something that you want to add to what I'm talking about, or some way that you think about it that might be useful to everybody else. I mean, that's what the chat's for. I think it's exciting when the chat is kind of lively. So please feel free to do that. And then Jenny and I will be talking at the end. We'll have time to answer questions there too. So please feel free to do that. Okay, so Refuse to be Done talks about novel writing through 3 drafts. I'm just gonna put them all up on the screen here real quick. And thinking about each of these requiring different kinds of rewriting and revision. So the first draft, exploratory draft, that requires generative revision, the kind of revision that helps you continue to write, that helps you sort of stay in the process. And then the second draft, which requires narrative revision, where we're really trying to get the story and the plot and the structure the best it can be. And then a third draft, which I think of as polishing revision, which really means just making like everything the best it can be and making that turn from the writer-based version of the book to the reader-based version that you're going to send to your readers, if you're your agent or editor. So we'll kind of go through these in order and talk about the way I approach each of these 3 parts. So the first draft we're going to talk about as generative revision. And I think a lot of the practices in this section of the book really come down to what Lucy Corrin is talking about in this quote that I'll read in a second, which is from an essay of hers called Material that's in the Tin House Writer's Notebook, which is one of my favorite craft books. I can't recommend enough. Corrin says, you should look at the material you produce to find your material, that the story is always smarter than you. There'll be patterns of theme, image, and idea that are much savvier and more complex than you could have come up with on your own. Become a student of your work in progress. Every aspect of a story has its own story. So some of what we're going to be doing here is like really learning to look at the material we're making to discover the book as we write it. And so to start with just maybe some general thoughts about the first draft of the novel. I'm going to use this phrase probably more than once, but I think of the draft as a first draft as an exploratory draft, that I'm discovering the story by writing it. And in doing so, I slowly become the kind of writer who can write the book I'm trying to write. I don't start with an outline. Usually I don't often even know a lot about what the book's going to be about. Sometimes I have a character, I have a setting I'm interested in, but I really find a lot of what's in my novel by writing it. And I also think it's worth remembering that the task of any given day is never to write a novel, that the task of writing a novel is too daunting of an idea. It's really easy to be discouraged, that the novel is this accumulation of smaller efforts that you combine as you go. Sometimes to make myself sort of feel better about my own productivity, I do a little math. I think this is correct, though I'm not a mathematician, but if you write 500 words a day, 5 days a week for a year, which is what I ask my novel writing students to do in my classes, that'll add up to about 130,000 words, which is of course more than enough for a novel draft. 500 words is about 2 pages, double spaced in Times New Roman. All of my published novels are shorter than that, you know, so it's a practice that allows you to write a couple pages at a time is more than enough to write a novel. And then I'll just also say that if you're writing your first novel right now, your first book of nonfiction, or whatever it is, I really think that reaching the finish line, writing a beginning, middle, and end of that draft will do more for your future as a novelist than almost anything else. I think just knowing that you can produce a book draft gives you confidence for the next one, even if the first one doesn't become what you want it to be. Before I wrote my first published novel, I wrote 2 novel drafts that I've just put immediately in a drawer. I never really showed them to anybody. I sort of knew they weren't what I wanted to do, but the confidence of having written those drafts, I think, really came with me when I got onto the book that would eventually become my first draft. So I mentioned that I don't outline before I begin, but one of the things I've been sort of obsessed with, and this isn't in Refuse to Be Done, this is sort of something I've been thinking about more recently, are not outlines for getting started. Something that sort of gives you a shape of the book, or lets you sort of gives you a guideline to sort of go on. And one of these 2 variations on the log line, which is, you know, a term we get from screenwriting. It's usually a 1-sentence description of the entire story. And I think these 2 versions of this can be useful to you if you can write these at the beginning of a novel or in the early days of writing a novel. The first is a single sentence with an ironic twist. A classic example of this is the movie Die Hard. A New York City cop goes to LA to visit his family at Christmas, only to find his wife's workplace overrun with terrorists, right? There's sort of this like scenario and then the unexpected thing. That doesn't tell you the plot of Die Hard, but you could discover it thinking about that. And then the second one is a single sentence that includes a character, a conflict, and a clock. The example I use here often is Cinderella. Cinderella has to get the prince to fall in love with her before midnight, or else her clothes will turn to rags, right? That's not like every beat of the plot, but you can see a character who has a want, has a conflict, and this clock that they have to complete it in. And just having those 3 elements will give you some of what you need to write a novel. And then this other kind of not outline is a question central to the novel that each major character would answer differently. I think sometimes you might know this when you're starting out, but more often you're going to discover it as you go. The example I've been using for this is Game of Thrones. Who should be king of Westeros is a question that everyone in that novel would answer differently. Everyone in that show would answer differently. And the ways in which they're different is I'm sorry, is there somebody I can mute here? I can hear somebody else still. Yeah, let me see if I can do it. I'm just gonna stop for a second, try to mute everybody. Okay. All right, I think everybody's muted. Sorry, stop and do that. Okay, so we're talking about some general tactics just for getting through the first draft, some things that I think are useful. One of the things I make all my novel writing students do is have a working title from day one. I try to avoid like the like a novel2.docx, those kind of like not really committing to a novel title. And one of the reasons for it is this idea from Kevin Brockmeyer, where he says, I think of the title as the target toward which I shoot the arrow of the story. And I love that idea that the title tells you where you're going and what your book is trying to become. And I think that sometimes a good title will keep teaching you as you go. But the other reason is that by titling the book, you can talk about it as if it's sort of done, as if it exists already. When I was writing my novel Appleseed, being able to talk to my friends about this novel called Appleseed that I was writing made it seem like it already existed, that I was discovering it, as opposed to like, oh, I'm working on a book, I'm working on a novel, which feels a little more half committed to me. So I think having a title will make you feel better about the book, which I like a lot. One of the other things I always suggest for the first draft is this idea from Charlie Smith that he calls writing the islands. And what he means by that is that you write the parts of the book you can see right now. That even if you don't know what else is going to happen in the book, you probably have some scene that is like the reason you want to write the book. You can kind of visualize it. And then we often spend a lot of time writing toward that scene or writing other things trying to get to it. And I think if you just write the parts of the book you're most excited about or get them drafted, it helps you sort of follow your own excitement and write the kind of things that the reasons you're passionate about the book in the first place. In my experiences, once you write those islands, new ones appear. But there's something about trying to get to a scene by writing other things that ends up not being very productive for me. Usually the islands are also places where like the story is happening. So they produce cause and effect, and they sort of show you some of the other things that might happen in the story. I really think in the first draft, especially, like to always be writing things that you feel excited about. And this is one of the ways to do that. I also teach my students in novel writing classes what I think of as reading what you've written predictively, which means looking at a chapter that you've written and thinking about what themes you see being set up in that chapter, what character wants you see expressed, ways in which characters seem to be in conflict with each other, things your characters are worried about or avoiding or don't want to know about themselves. And as you look at your own work predictively, you then write what you predict. So it's a way of sort of discovering your material by looking at your material, as Corin said. I practice this on published books. I'll stop after reading a chapter and think about those same questions, trying to see what I expect to see in the future of the book because of what I've read in like chapter 1 or chapter 2. And that can be a really useful way to sort of train your brain to do this in your own work. But very often the answers for what comes next come from what you've already written, or at least they do for me. And then I think, part of every novel is research. One of the reasons I like being a novelist is to do the research. I really enjoy novel research. But it's easy to get overwhelmed by your research. It's easy to feel bogged down in it. And one of the rules I've come up with for myself is that I don't take notes on anything that I'm reading for research, because the notes kind of become inert. They're really hard to translate into fiction later. But what I use my research for is generative prompts. So if I'm reading a book of research and I find like a fact that I think is really interesting or an image that I want to include, I don't let myself write it down unless I write it down in the novel, kind of in the voice of the book. And so I use that to write a paragraph or to write a scene, or I use it in dialogue and let a character be the person who knows that thing. And that keeps my research always being filtered through the lens of the novel as opposed to existing separately from it. I frequently fill like a whole bookshelf with research materials where I'm writing a novel. I know how easy it is to be overwhelmed. And this is one of the ways I help myself from doing that. And then I have these two sort of ideas that go together. One is from George Saunders in an interview at Bomb magazine. If you look up George Saunders Bomb, you'll find it. He talks about what he calls steering toward the rapids, by which he means like if you were going down a boat on a river, your normal job would be to like avoid the rocks, right, to sort of get smoothly down the river, but you want to put your characters in trouble. So you're steering them toward the rapids. And I think what the goal is there, of course, to get your characters in trouble, to get them into conflict with each other, to make things sort of difficult on them so that they can react. And this sort of similar idea from Charles Baxter, where he talks about making a scene by causing a scene, all the things you were taught not to do that make you sort of a polite, nice person to be in society with, that your characters mostly have to do the opposite, at least in certain respect. One of the things I look for in my own work is when a character says, I wanted to say, but they didn't say it, or I thought about doing, but they didn't do it. And sometimes turning those things into actions, it creates a lot of drama in the story. Like the character who will say the thing that no one else will say is a character who makes the story go. Dear Disaster, I mean by generative. All I mean by generative is you're generating prose, you're creating the novel, you're writing the work. So a generative workshop would be one in which you write the novel in the workshop, as opposed to a workshop where you bring something already written. So we're just talking about like practices that help us like produce pages. Thank you for asking. And then I'm thinking also, of course, how we can discover our characters by writing them. I think I don't usually know everything about my characters as I begin. In fact, sometimes I know very, very little. I really love this quote from Claire Vaye Watkins, where she says, you need to know the story the characters are telling themselves. And then beyond that, you have to know the story your characters are telling themselves about the stories they tell themselves. And what I think Claire means by this is, we all have our sort of origin stories we tell. We have our stories about why we are the way we are, or our sort of beliefs about how we should be in the world. And when you know that about a character, you have an idea of how they will react in new situations. And it gives you something to sort of be tested by the novel. And of course, the places where our stories are false or are self-mythologizing or something is something that novels test. But we're trying to understand who the character thinks they are, how they tell themselves, how they present themselves to other people. Just one of the things we're sort of looking for, trying to discover in this first draft. And one of the things I think you can do for yourself that will make the novel go better is every chance you can to keep your characters acting and keep your characters making choices. Scenes in which your protagonist does not act or make a choice will often feel kind of stalled. It makes it hard for them to create new sort of cause and effect and create new scenes. So our scenes that don't seem like they're working or that seem like they're stalled in some way, I would look for chances for the characters to do something or for them to make a choice about something that has stakes in the world. And I think this is especially true in the first person drafts, especially like first drafts often have like observer protagonists. They're the camera through which you're discovering the world. And so they look a lot as opposed to act a lot. So you're looking for ways to make sure that your first person protagonist is acting. It's a little less prevalent, I think, in the third person, but especially in the first. It can be one of the things that happens. And what we're trying to do here is create change in our scenes. Scenes in which nothing changes do not create future scenes. They don't have sort of cause and effect generation. So thinking about different kinds of change, this first list is from Jeff Vandermeer's Wonder Book. It says change that can occur in a scene might be a discovery, a complication, a reversal, or a resolution. So if a character needs to know information and at the end of the scene they now know it, then that's enough change, right? So in a detective novel, a character is questioning a witness and they learn another clue. That's the change that makes it. A complication would be where a character thinks they can achieve a goal, but then it turns out to be more complicated than it is. And so then they have to do something else in another scene to get close to that goal. So looking for some of these kinds of things when we're analyzing our scenes and we're looking at what's happening to them. And then this other is just the flipping of a binary, which can sometimes be really like dramatic changes, like a character who was alive is now dead. That means something has changed in that scene, right? But looking for places, a character who's happy is now sad. A character who was worried about something now has that worry relieved. Like anything that creates sort of change by the actions and choices that characters are making. Stacy asked a question about research. So I feel guilty when I stop mid-writing to research something to put it in. Are you suggesting this is a valid technique? Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm always looking things up, or I don't sort of know the answer for it. I will say that I think I just make up the answer a lot in a first draft to keep writing. I think, you're like a smart, intelligent, sensitive person who knows something about the world. And often you can get pretty close on a guess. But sometimes you do just have to stop to sort of research this. Martha just asked if there are more types of scenes, examples in the book. Absolutely. Almost everything I'm talking about is talked about at like sort of greater length in the book. So don't feel if this is coming sort of too fast at you that you're not going to get a chance to sort of know this. And Blake's also going to send out a like private recording of this to you all, so you'll be able to review it as well. So hopefully that will help. And then I'm going to talk about these sort of 6 scenes to write when I get stuck. It's one of the ways I try to get things going again. You will inevitably get stuck writing a first draft, or at least I inevitably get stuck writing a first draft and not knowing what to write. The first is to write these 3 scenes that come from an article I read about scenario planning one time in the New Yorker. And scenario planning is just when like an organization tries to predict what might happen in the future for their organization. And one way you do this is to try to figure out the good thing that might happen, the bad thing that might happen, and the weird thing. So I sometimes assign myself this task to write 3 new scenes in which something goes well for my protagonist, where something goes bad for my protagonist and where something weird happens to my protagonist. Or ideally they cause something weird to happen. And usually if I write those three scenes, I'll shake something out, like something sort of new will occur to me. It gets me out of the rut of the book. And then I have these three scenes that are really about power, in the way that we have power sort of our own, and also the way people wield power on us. But it's about our relationship to power and relationship to other characters. A scene in which your protagonist does something to someone else, which means they're acting upon them. A scene in which your protagonist does something for someone else, which means they act on their behalf. And then a scene in which your protagonist has something done to them, so they're acted upon and then react. You can see in these three scene descriptions that they all contain sort of choices and actions, that these are places where your characters are going to be doing something, and they will produce new work should you write those. And I just want to talk about maybe some general revision tactics for the first draft. Like I said, each draft kind of needs different kinds of revision, but these are the things that I think are maybe most important for the first draft. I review my pages later every day. I try to write like 5 days a week. That's just sort of my practice. And on days I know I'm going to write the next day, I will look at the pages I wrote the day before. Sorry, Tamara, the last scene is a scene in which your protagonist has something done to them, is acted upon, and then reacts. And again, you'll have a chance to review these slides as well. But I look at the pages I've written the day before, and I only really read until I find one thing to fix. And the goal is to have something to do as soon as I sit down the next day. So I don't sit at my computer not sure what to do, or not really ready to write yet, but I sort of know that I'm going to sit down and I'm going to fix sometimes something as small as a typo. There's a missing word in a sentence. Sometimes I see an idea for a new way to open a scene. I'm like, oh, this opening isn't as good as I want it to be. I'm going to revise it this way. I'm really just looking for like a thing to get myself started the next day. And so by doing that every day, you start by making the already written part of the book better, and it helps you see how to get going. And I would say, like, along that same lines, almost every day I retreat like 3 pages and just revise some of the most recently written material. The first time I wrote a novel, one of those 2 novel drafts that I just stuck in a drawer, I had this idea that novel writing was about momentum, that you just wanted to go as fast as possible from the beginning to the end, so you didn't like lose your inspiration. And for me, that produced an unreadable book. And so now my goal is to like try to do some revision as I go, so that the book is sort of improving as I'm writing it. When I do get stuck and I really have no idea what to write, I'll back up a bigger chunk, like 30 pages, 40 pages, and I'll just revise to the front of the book or to the blank part of the book, just trying to sort of build momentum and sort of discover some of the stuff we've been talking about as we go. And in this way, you're sort of always improving the book as you go. So your first draft will be a little cleaner than mine used to be. And I think a really important thing to talk about this part, for me at least, is to write the best sentences you can, but don't maybe fixate on the quality of the prose to the point that you can't proceed. I love sentence level writing. I love the sound of prose. I love sort of playing with language in that way. It's really, in many ways, the reason I'm a writer. So I think I love that the most. But I know I'm going to revise everything. I know I'm going to rewrite everything. And so I do let myself be a little looser in this draft. One of the things that I found in my practice is that I can't do everything at once. And sometimes when like the plot wheel really has to turn, when a big thing has to happen in a scene, my sentences just like fall apart. And I think that's reasonably common. Same when I'm writing dialogue. Dialogue is really hard for me, trying to write in 2 different people's voices talking to each other. And the sentences around the dialogue will just be like mush, And I sort of have learned that it's okay that I can't do everything at once. So that sometimes I'm just getting the action down, or I'm just getting the dialogue right, and that I will later sort of fix some of the other stuff. So being a little loose in that way has been sort of helpful for me, which is a way of saying that you have to suspend judgment as you're writing. I really love this quote from Jane Smiley. It's a little longer, but I'm going to sort of end our first draft section with talking about this. Jane Smiley says, "You don't know what you're writing until it's done." Certainly true of me. So if a draft is 500 pages long, you have to suspend judgment for months. It takes effort to be good at suspending judgment, to give the images and story priority over your ideas, but you keep going, casting about for the next sentence. I think there are 2 kinds of sentences in a rough draft: seeds and pebbles. If it's a pebble, it's the next sentence and it sits there. If it's a seed, it grows into something that becomes an important part of the life of the novel. The problem is you can't know ahead of time whether a sentence will be a seed or a pebble, or how important a seed is going to be. That feels exactly the experience of writing a first draft of a novel to me, in which some of the things are really important and some of the things I'm just writing to sort of get through it. But one day we will have finished a first draft of our novel. This is a time to celebrate. My celebration always feels a little mixed. I'm always very proud of myself for written a beginning, middle, and end. I'm also usually aware that it does not quite look like a publishable book. So I think, I always feel excited, but also the work ahead. I think a lot about this Borges story on exactitude of science. I don't know if anybody knows it. It's like 2 pages long. It's about a kingdom of cartographers who set out to make a perfect map of the kingdom they live in. And they end up making this 1-to-1 map of the kingdom. So it's the exact same size as the kingdom. And of course, it's not a very useless map or very useful map. And I think in my first drafts, a lot like that map, that I've made this like book-shaped object that is not quite a book. And then I take a break. I think this is really important. I think you have to sort of pause between drafts. And I think these 2 different things have to happen. I think you need to have some art time, you need to make something else. It might not even be more writing, but like some other kind of creative thing that gets your brain working differently than it has been in your novel. And then I think you just need to do something else, like a certain amount of lived time. I think ideally what I'm trying to do is get to a place where I'm not thinking about the book every day anymore, that I want some space. For me, it's usually like at least a month in this space. Leslie asked, how do you know when you finish the draft? For a first draft, I would say the draft is finished when it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Like that's sort of like the bare minimum for this draft. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't, everything has to have to be there, but I think you have to go this whole distance, especially for your first novel. Later, I've sometimes written like partial drafts, and then I move on to the second draft sort of stage that we're going to talk about in a minute. But I think first time out, beginning, middle, and end, if you can get that. It's okay if there's a missing chunk here or there. It's okay if some things aren't working perfectly. We're going to talk about how we're going to deal with that in just a second. And so we're going to go into the second draft, which I mentioned is narrative revision. We're going to really work on like story and plot. But before we do that, I love this quote from Hilary Mantel, where she says, "I have to take a deep breath before I start the first full revision. I used to hate myself for procrastinating, but now I see it might be wise. You need to pause in holy fear at what you've done and make sure you don't wreck it in panic." So we're going to pause in holy fear. I'm going to drink a sip of water, and then we'll move on to the second draft. So I mentioned at the beginning that I don't outline before I write a first draft. Again, nothing wrong if you do. For me, that usually is not that useful. But what I do is I reverse outline at this stage of the process. So I outline the draft I've written and make a scheme or outline or map of it. I sometimes think of this as a narrative outline or a beat sheet. And what I'm trying to outline is the action that occurs during the time narrated, which means the main sort of plank of time in your novel. So not the backstory, not sort of digressions or essayistic parts of the novel, but just the things that happen in sort of forward moving time. And you can do that in bullet points. You can do that in paragraphs. I often do it in paragraphs in sort of summary form because it feels more like writing to me, like it sort of like still have prose that can work. But whatever way you want to do this is totally fine. And what the goal of this is so that we can study what Jim Shepard calls the rate of revelation, which I think is a really useful idea. And he means the sense we have of the pace at which we're learning crucial emotional information about the story's central figures. If you're writing a novel with a lot of world building, like I often do, there's a similar kind of rate of revelation, like how fast we're learning things about the world that we're in. So we're studying this in this way. We're going to talk about how we're going to study it in just a second here, but really just trying to get down the action of the novel. Once we do this, we're now going to study and revise the outline to plan the second draft. So I'm making changes to this outline now that I've written it. The main thing I'm trying to do is analyze the shape of the novel's plot as expressed in the novel structure. So I'm looking for what's missing, what takes too long to happen, where's the inciting incident, some of these things, just looking for where they occur in the book and maybe what isn't adding up right. Just to give you an example, one of the things I might be looking at, there's more on this in the book as well, is if you're writing kind of a 3-act structure, which many novels are, the inciting incident begins the book and the character reacts to it for some time. But eventually there's this moment in most finished books where the character starts acting and takes charge of driving the plot. I'm looking for that moment in my outlines, trying to see if it's strong, if it's clear. In Lord of the Rings, there's a moment where Frodo like decides to take the ring to Mount Doom, right? Decides to go to Mordor. And that's the place where he really becomes the protagonist of the novel. It really becomes the hero of the story. And so we're looking for that place where your protagonist chooses to be the hero of their story. So it might be one of the things I'm looking for here. Most novels are driven by causality, not all, but most, with each scene kind of made necessary by the one before it. So I'm looking for the cause and effect chain of my novel. How does scene 1 cause scene 2, cause scene 3? I'm sort of studying the ways in which this is happening. And if it doesn't seem to be happening, I'm trying to fix it. We talked about scene and action before. I think this is sort of related. In every scene I outline, I look for what changes in this scene. How are things different because this scene occurred? Scenes that don't produce change, again, may be sort of static or unnecessary, or maybe just not doing the work they need to do yet. And then I think the overall effect I'm looking for is this thing Robert McKee, who's a screenwriter, talks about in his book Story, which is, I think, one of the best books for studying plot that I know about. He says the story must not retreat to actions of lesser quality or magnitude, but move progressively forward to a final action beyond which the audience cannot imagine another. So it really just means the action has to get bigger and better as it goes, even if it just means like the emotional reveals are better, or the emotional sort of like outcome of the scenes is better. That, you know, it doesn't always have to be like, you know, bigger battle scenes or something, but like somehow the novel has to become of higher quality at every step, and that we're trying to figure out how to do that. And then I think the other thing to remember here is that this outline you make is the scale model of the book. As any of you who've tried to move like chapters in a novel, it's so hard to move like the real prose, but moving scenes is pretty easy in this scheme because they're a sentence, right? You're a bullet point. And so moving them around should be pretty easy. It should be pretty easy to try different kinds of arrangements. I sometimes do this with like note cards, right? So you can move the scenes around, or you can do different things with them. And this is the place where I do that. This slide is going to look really stressful, and I'm also going to sort of gloss over it. It's like an hour-long lecture just on this slide, so I'm not going to tell you all that. One of the things I found really useful is taking existing sort of novel structures and then trying to map my outline against them, or look at my outline in concert with them. I have a newsletter at mattbell.substack.com. Maybe Blake can throw that in the chat for you all, so it's easy for you to see. I wrote an outline or a newsletter, like a 2,000-word essay just about how to do this. So it's there if that would be useful for you. But these are some of the sort of outline or kinds of structures that I'm thinking about. So, you know, all really kind of typical traditional structures here, the sort of 3-act structure that we get from film, Freytag's pyramid that many of us were taught in creative writing workshops, kind of serial or episodic plots of like Huckleberry Finn or The Road. And then, of course, these more complicated sort of multiple storylines or nesting structures. And what I'm really looking for when I'm doing this is not to make my book into a formula, but to see what might be missing by comparing it to a formula. And I found this to be like a really helpful way of discovering things that are missing in the scene. Obviously, I know I'm going like way too quickly over this. So, you know, please check that version of that out in the newsletter, but we can talk about it in Q&A as well. So then I've got this revised outline. This process has taken me a couple weeks for my novel Appleseed, which is a very complicated structure. I spent like 3 months writing this outline, like between drafts. Like it was kind of a huge job, but really, really useful for me. And then once I have this, I begin to rewrite the novel. And for me, the second draft is the one that really feels like I'm writing a book. In the first draft, I was letting myself write the islands or write stuff out of order, different things. In this draft, I try to go beginning to end, following the outline, not going on until something's pretty good. Like I stay with things a little more. But what I do is I retype the book from scratch, writing the sort of better book I outlined and planned from the first. And I know how dramatic that sounds. For me, it's been such a useful process, and the outcome has been so good that I have not yet really skipped it. I always do this. And what I do is I use the first draft as a guide. So I steal whatever I can from it, but I always retype. So I don't let myself cut and paste, because cutting and pasting is not revision. My belief, at least what I've learned for myself, is that I will not retype terrible prose, but I will cut and paste it. And so like a scene that's not working, if I start retyping it, I start seeing what needs to be done to it. But cutting and pasting it allows it to sort of stay broken. I have two monitors at home. That's how I do it. I put like the old version on one monitor and like a blank document on the new one. You can do it with a printout. You can do it on an iPad, a phone, so somewhere else where you have it. I often call the first draft the diminishing draft, and I just delete things from it as I use them or as I retype them. And sort of, when I first came up with that idea, my first published novel, I had this idea that the diminishing draft would one day be 0 and the new draft would sort of be full length, right? That would be sort of this like power transfer kind of. And what you're really trying to get here, I think, is what Amy Tan talked about in this interview, where she said, only when I finish the book can I go back to the beginning and write in the voice of all that happened. So in the first draft, we're writing prose to discover what our novel is. And in the second draft, we're writing prose with the knowledge of what our novel is and the knowledge of what happens in it. I don't know if this is the case for all of you, but what I found, especially in novel writing, because you write for so long, is that one of the hardest things to do is to make the stuff I wrote last or stuff I wrote first as good as the stuff I wrote last. Because at the end, I sort of know everything about the book. I know about the voice. I know the characters. And this rewriting is one of the ways that I get around that. In my experience, these two drafts have taken about the same amount of time. So if it takes me a year to write a first draft, it takes me a year to write a second draft. Obviously, your mileage may vary kind of wildly there. But that's the main step of the second draft is I'm writing to this outline. I'm rewriting it. I'm still doing a lot of things I did in the first draft again because I'm writing, but I'm again staying more linearly and trying to get everything as right as I can. So one day you finish the second draft, you take a break, you make something else. And for me, this is probably like the earliest I would let someone else read the book. Maria just asked how many hours a day I write. Wildly variable. My ideal writing life is like from breakfast to lunch, like 5 days a week. And sometimes I can do that, sometimes I can't. But that's sort of my ideal. I actually can't draft more than a couple hours a day most of the time. At the very, very end of projects, I do something, I work really long hours. Maybe we'll talk about that at the end, but like most of the time, drafting a book, sometimes 2 hours is great, if I can get it. But sometimes I'm writing in very, very small chunks too. So it really just depends. So at this stage, after we finish the second draft, the story is successfully plotted and structured. So everything, the sort of story works, it's readable, a person would enjoy it if they read it. And now we're going to begin the work of polishing the draft and making it the best it can be. And what I think I'm advocating here is for a layered approach to this third draft, which means we're going to break the work into many individual activities. In the same way that like the task of any one day is never to write a novel when you're drafting, the task now is not like to make the whole novel good any day. Like we're going to break it into things that you can do chapter by chapter or kind of all the way through the book without trying to address everything at once. Excuse me, just a second. Example of a pass I might do is dialogue. For me is the thing that I think I'm worst at. I think I really struggle with dialogue. And one thing I'll do is I'll go all the way through the book and I'll work on just the places where dialogue appear. So I'm just trying to prove those spots. And I'm thinking about a couple of things. One is I'm looking at the balance of direct versus indirect versus summarized dialogue. And basically, the direct dialogue, things are in quotes, things are being quoted directly. It's the place where things that are dramatic needs to appear. Usually if characters are saying something that has sort of dramatic weight, then it has to be in that. Where summarized dialogue is really good for things that are just informational. So sort of balancing these things. But a lot of what makes dialogue feel dynamic is we're switching between these three kinds of dialogue. And again, there's sort of a longer explanation of that in the book. And I'm also thinking about the ways in which fictional conversation is competition. Where does the balance of power or control shift as a conversation continues? I always feel very cynical when I say this, but when I mean it's competition, I just mean that like when you're saying something, it's because you want something from the listener. And it might just be to have them think you're funny or intelligent or sexy. It might be that you're trying to get them to do something for you. It might be that you're trying to impart information to them, as I'm doing right now. But usually we're speaking for a reason, and our sort of want in the scene is part of what we're looking for. I also take this time to look for these kind of weak dialogue adjacent actions. The sighs, the smiles, the shrugs, the winks, the nods that we tend to pepper our drafts with. And so I'm looking for ways to replace those with more interesting action or to make the scene more dynamic in some way. There's nothing wrong with any of these individually, but I think we all sort of have our ones we overuse. And sometimes in a novel draft, I'll go and look and there'll be like dozens of shrugs, right? Everybody's just shrugging and trying to put something more interesting there. So I might do that during this draft. And then trying to replace with stronger action. When I don't delete things as I'm writing, I keep a cut file. So if I take something out or I have all the stuff left from that diminishing draft, we look through that material looking for kind of stronger action that I can take back to the novel and use in this place. It's been a useful way to get something out of my cut file. So I can do this chapter by chapter. The work of one day might be just get through chapter 1's dialogue or chapter 1 through 3's dialogue. And so that way the tasks are smaller and they're sort of achievable. And I'm looking for ways to not be overwhelmed. And as you're working on the dialogue, you will inevitably improve the things around the dialogue as well. So it is kind of a trick to doing more. This is also the place where I really start working on the prose style. I really let myself be obsessed with the sentences. One of the things I do is I go all the way through the book and I look at every verb in the novel. And what I'm trying to do is replace mundane or obvious choices with more precise or interesting ones. I think many of us, we're just trying to get through the sentences, right? And so we use the first verbs that come to mind. You know, often we reach for something fairly plain. But what I found is if you find the right verb, you can often delete like 2 sentences around the verb that are just there to, or 2 clauses in a sentence that are really just there describing a weak verb. So the better your verbs, the sort of more punchy your sentences are. And also I think that makes your prose more efficient. So I'll just do that all the way through the book. And every time I do that, the prose just like jumps a level. It's amazing how much better that will make your book sort of seem. I also go through and I look for these thought tags, thought, understood, new. In most of the kind of third person most American writers are writing, which is a very close third person or a like free indirect style, as James Wood would call it, it's usually pretty obvious when a character is thinking. We don't actually have to tag it. And sometimes when it's not obvious, there's a way to make it so that lets us remove some of this material. It reduces the mediation between like you and the character if you can get rid of some of this stuff. And similarly, I'm looking and hearing verbs, especially really all sensory verbs, but looking and hearing are most where you're going to look for. Looked, watched, saw, heard, listen. And what we're trying to do here is, again, like reduce the sort of distance between you and the events in the book. Instead of saying he looked at the burning car, just describe the burning car. We know it's the character who's looking at it, but it gets us closer to the image. Instead of she heard a gunshot, just describe the gunshot. A lot of times you can just chop these things off, right? But you might find that you need to rewrite sentences to get rid of them, but it'll make your images and your sensory details in your book more immediate. And then I think I'm looking for ways to vary sentence and paragraph lengths and constructions. I think variety is what actually makes style seem dynamic and interesting. You probably have like a default sentence type you like. You may be able to hear even from me talking, like I've never found a sentence that couldn't use like 10 more commas. Like I really like the long sentence. I write a lot of multi-clause sentences. I think in my first novel, there's a single sentence in the whole book that doesn't have a comma in it. Like they're all these sort of long loping sentences. But really what you want is variety. You want like a long sentence that's punched out with a short one, or you want sentences that work in different ways. So looking for ways to vary that throughout the book. And so as the book continues to sort of get better and better and better, finding new ways to get into it, at some point I print out the book, or else I send it to a tablet where you can highlight things. And I'm looking to do a couple things here. And I'll just go through these in order. I'll go through and I'll highlight everywhere I'm explaining something to the reader, any place that I'm telling them what something means. And what I really do after I highlight those is I mostly delete them all. And I try to leave them out. A lot of the explanation that's in a book draft is really a kind of scaffolding. It's something that you wrote to yourself as you were figuring out the book. A character acts and you explain what they did. That's you explaining to yourself. It's a version in some ways of your reading experience of your own novel. But the reader wants to figure those things out for themselves. They want to explore the subtext. They want to figure out what's happening. The phrase I use with my own students is the reader does not want your logic, right? They want to bring their own logic to it. And so getting those explanations out is one of the ways we make room for that. My first novel, when I sold it, was 125,000 words long, and the published version is 63,000, so it's about half. And most of what came out was these kind of explanations or or sort of beating the reader over the head with things. Very few sort of events came out. So this is one of the ways we look for that material. It's just to really explicitly look for explanations. Similarly, I'll go through and I'll highlight all of the backstory, especially all the flashbacks. And maybe two things here. One is I'm again trying to delete as much of it as I can. I don't think anyone's ever read a novel and been like, I wish there was more backstory in this. I think the least backstory you can get away with, the better. But I'm also looking for ways to make it more interesting. Flashbacks especially create narrative drag, right? They sort of stop the forward motion. And what I'm looking for sometimes is if I can translate the flashback into something a character can talk about in the present. So instead of a flashback that only the reader sort of sees in a separate part of the book, to have it be something that the character tells about themselves or character thinks about in the present, so that it has active stakes in the present of the story. I know backstory is always kind of a hard part about novel writing. Maybe I'll talk about that in Q&As as well. And then this really, like one of my favorite tricks, this last one, I'll go through the entire draft and I will highlight the weakest sentence in every paragraph, or if I can't find a whole sentence, the weakest part of a sentence in every paragraph. And then I will delete them all. My novel Appleseed has 2,500 paragraphs in the final version of it. At some point I did this with this book and I took out 2,500 sentences or parts of sentences. And you can imagine if you take out the weakest part of the book, like the whole rest of the book immediately seems that much better. Some of the places you delete something, you'll need to put something back. But again, I'll try to rewrite a new thing instead of kind of like tinkering with the bad thing. The thing that's not working. It's hard to tinker it into being good. It's easier to write something new there. Kristen asked if I would define weakest sentences. I mean, in some ways, this is something that everyone's going to have a different version of. Sometimes it's one that just doesn't sound as good as the other ones. Sometimes it's a place where the action doesn't seem very interesting. It's the one extra piece of dialogue that can go in a speech someone's giving, and sort of going to be paragraph by paragraph. But by forcing myself to pick the weakest thing, even if it's different in every paragraph, I'm just putting more pressure on the sort of prose of the book. And and it also creates compression, right? Because the book obviously will get shorter as you do this. I just had a short story published that like contractually could not be longer than 6,000 words. It was like 6,900. And I was like, I can't find any way to make this shorter. And I did this weakest sentences tactic to it. And it was like 1,000 words shorter when I was done with it. And again, didn't take out any events, didn't take out any story moments. I really just took out like the bottom 10% of the prose. And for me, that really helps. Christy, I'm gonna come back to your question. That's a great question. I let me answer that once I'll breathe at the end of this and we'll come back. That seems really a smart thing to talk about. And then at some point, I think I'm really trying to cut everything I can live without, which is in some ways really what we were just doing in that highlighter step. And I love this this idea from Chris Offutt. He's riffing off Hemingway's iceberg theory. He says, I've cut thousands of pages from my work, but those cut pages were necessary to the final draft. To me, the final product is like an iceberg. You only see 10% of the actual work, but the other 90% is still there. And I think that last part is really crucial, that the reader feels all this stuff you've taken out of the book, because the characters sort of know about it and the characters react to it. And if you cut their flashbacks, you cut their memories, but the characters still have those memories. And the reader really does sort of feel like the book is bigger than what they're left with in a really satisfying way. When I first heard that, like Hemingway iceberg theory, like, you only show 10% of the iceberg in a story, I thought that you just had to be like this genius who could like intuit what that 10% was. But I think what really happens is like you make the iceberg and then you cut it out. And so I think that's been more my experience, that a lot of the stuff I'm taking out in this phase is things that I needed to write the book, but don't to be there. Again, the sort of scaffolding you take down before you open the building. And then I have these sort of last three things I'm going to offer. Then we'll stop and take some questions. And that this is the phase where like the book is pretty much done. The book is absolutely readable. I could absolutely send it to my agent. I know it's going to get edited again in the publishing process, but I still want to make it the absolute best I can before I do. Francine Prose once called this putting every word on trial for its life, changing an adjective, cutting a phrase, removing a comma, putting it back in, this sort of final pressure. And I do a couple of things to make that for myself. One is this list of weasel words that make your sentences like slightly weaker than they might otherwise be, or that maybe they're sort of like crutch words that let me get through a sentence without really thinking as hard as I can about it. There's a very big list of these in the book. And I just go through like control, find, and word, and I look at every one. I won't go through this whole list. You can see it on the screen. I'll just use an example. The word that is functional in sentences. It does work, but there's many times you can take that out without injuring the sentence. And so it's just like a non-load bearing part of the sentence. Or you can rewrite a sentence so you don't need to use it. In my novel Scrapper, I went through and tried to take out as many that's as I could, like at this stage, like very late in the process. And I took 900 uses of the word that out of the book. Page of prose is about 250 words, which means I took 3.5 pages of the word that out of the book that the reader never had to read. And the reader would not have noticed those, right? Like they wouldn't have, there wasn't anything wrong with them, but the book is like subtly faster because those are gone. So I'll do this for quite some time. And then this tactic from Pam Houston that I really love that is called pulling up your widows. In typesetting, widows are, if you look on the screen right now, you see that like back in at the end of that first paragraph, that's a widow. And so it doesn't matter what they look like in your Word doc, your published book won't look like that. But I go through the whole book and I try to make the paragraphs end at the right margin so they don't have those extra words. And the idea of that really is like when you think you can't possibly edit the prosing or you can't possibly make it better, that you go back and you find these ways to get rid of those words, or ways to find one more thing to cut in that paragraph, one more thing to write in a more efficient way. And it puts a little pressure on the work. The last time I think I did this with a novel, I cut like 10,000 words from the book in this phase, which felt crazy. Like, I mean, it seemed like I'd worked in that book so hard, and this was like that final pressure. These kind of last few things we've been talking about are for me often when the book goes to looking more like a published book. I'm starting like, oh, this is like how real books look. It does this last bit of pressure on it. And then the very last thing I do before I send a book to my readers or I send a book to my agent is I read the book aloud, cover to cover, so that I can't skim it, so that I can't skip it. So I really sort of see what's in the book. And there is a way here where I make some small adjustments, I improve some things, but the real point of this is so that I can experience the book myself one more time before I give it to anybody else. So this is the place where I'm about to let go of the book and I get to experience the sort of best possible version of it I could make on my own. I think that's really important. I think that's a real gift you can give yourself before you enter the publishing process, before you get feedback from people that just, you've spent a year, 2 years, or for me, usually like 3.5 years a book. You get to have the experience that you've earned through that work. And I think that can be really important. So that is sort of my final action that I take in this moment. Now, just say that I know everything I sort of described today is a lot of work. I recognize that it may sound like too much work, but I think like for me, like the pleasure of a lot of this is really rich, and that I really, the books become the kind of thing I hope they would become by doing all these things. That this process for me at least has worked several times and has really helped me stay with it. And I love this Jane Smiley quote. If it was shorter, I would get it like tattooed on my chest, like memento style. So I saw it every day. But she says, I believe that you either love the work or the rewards, and life is a lot easier if you love the work. And for me, that has certainly been the case. I'm going to stop here. I'll shut off the PowerPoint so we can see each other's faces again. I know Jenny's here. Jenny's going to come in and lead the Q&A with us. And yeah, I'm great at that. Thanks so much for listening to this. I know it's like a ton of information. Almost all of this is said in a smarter way in the book. So when you get your book, please hopefully you can review it there and get the answers you need. Hi, Jenny.
Hi, sorry, I'm a bit late. We had a bit of a family emergency, but we got some great questions, Matt, and I've got a few set aside as well. So let me go ahead and get started. There are some questions related to as you were presenting, and then there are some that are more specific about how you write. So let me start first with, and I'll go with the most recent one actually, about, you were talking about the weasel words, and don't you need some of these weasel words to make the dialogue realistic, especially if the characters are children or teenagers?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The dialogue is a different case than like narration, right? That you still want to put probably pressure on your dialogue. Dialogue realism is not often exactly the goal in dialogue, but that makes total sense to me that there could be those different kinds of things there, and a different kind of prose might have it, right? Like I think if you're writing a certain kind of humor or something, right, you will use more sort of that kind of spacing or delay to create effects. So yeah, of course, none of this is one size fits all. I think dialogue is a great example of a place where you might want to leave more of that in than you would elsewhere.
and I have a follow-up to that on dialogue, which is, we talk about different voices.
Yeah.
And you talk a little bit about that in the book, but what kind of generative exercises or what would you recommend, for example, if I'm writing historical fiction and I'm trying to write about, a totally different time and a character who doesn't even, live today? Any recommendations for how to manage different voices that way?
Yeah, I think a lot for historical stuff, especially Laird Hunt is a favorite novelist, wrote a series of really great sort of historical novels in the last couple of years, starting with a book called Kind One that I really love. And I had Laird in one of my classes once, and we were asking about the voice of the book, which it takes place around the Civil War, but it has kind of, he referred to it as an invented vernacular, that it sounds kind of like what you imagine people might have talked like then, but it is not. Like, it doesn't sound like Civil War, like letters home to your wife while you're fighting the Civil War, right? So it's somehow a blend, sort of like a contemporary diction and this sort of like historical. And I think that feels better to me when I'm writing historical things. And somehow this is just vibes, right? Like the vibes are good. It feels kind of like that, but it fits in my more contemporary prose that you don't need to mimic exactly the kind of written language people were using at that time, which probably wasn't very indicative of their voice anyway out loud, right? Like people wrote more formally than they spoke, I think, a lot of times. So
yeah,
I'm trying to find that invented vernacular seems to be part of that.
Right. I mean, I think of, for example, Hilary Mantel, the Cromwell trilogy. She doesn't write in that medieval English, style, but it still feels like, okay, it is of that time. Yeah. And so it's a way of creating.
Yeah. A trick that I found has been really good for that is old dictionaries. Like I have like a dictionary from like 1900. And so the word choices are just a little different, right? Like sometimes mining like an older dictionary. I also have an etymology dictionary, which is what it sounds like, but you look up like the history of words instead of the definitions. And there's often like an older or weirder version of the word that sometimes sits in really well and can make that effect. Yeah. So I think that seems to be one of the ways I might do that.
Yep. And then let's go to another question about short stories. And somebody asked, they keep every version of their short story through the revision process in case there's revision remorse. Right. And how does that look for a whole book? Do you keep everything you cut? And I know you've mentioned a lot about that in the book because, you talk about rewriting when you're revising, but do you keep everything that you cut?
I do, yeah. I have like huge cut files for books, including I save a new version of the file every day, so I also could have revision remorse and just roll back a day if I wanted. So part of that I do that so the directory fills up with like files. You can see like the 400 days I worked on the book or something. It just is another way of seeing progress. But I do keep a cut file with every book that I just dump things in as I cut them out or as I use a different version. Mostly I don't go back to it. It almost always just kind of sits there, but I think it makes me feel like I haven't lost that material. I know my cut files are about the same size as the book often when I'm done. I mean, I'm an overwriter who cuts back for sure, so that's part of it. But I know for my second novel, the cut file for that book was like over 100,000 words. Like I just had a huge amount of prose in it. And that book is like 70,000 words in print or something, right? So like I cut more than I left by the time I was done. But some of that is like multiple tries at a scene, right? Like there's like 5 versions of a scene or something in there. So, but yeah, I keep it all. Every once in a while, something comes back out of it or is useful, but it is pretty rare for me to actually go back. But I think it makes me feel secure. It makes me feel brave to revise.
Right. And so talking about cut files as well, I want to switch a little bit to research. And you've talked about this in the book as well, and which I thought was very interesting, which is that when you're doing research, you'll stop mid-research because if it's something you want to use, and you'll only do it if it's something you want to use. Because I think with a lot of us writers, we tend to go down rabbit holes, right? I mean, we can start with a little bit of research in the morning, and by the end of the day, we're still doing that research. And so the advice that you give, the question was, somebody wrote, I feel guilty when I stop mid-writing to go research something to put it back in, and then so are you suggesting this is a valid technique, or how do you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all writing, right? I mean, there is probably, if you researched for 3 years and didn't write any prose, then you're maybe researching novel writing. But I don't think there's anything wrong with stopping to research. And of course, there's phases where you just have to get it right. The bookshelf behind me is like partly, this is the back corner of my home office, and the books that are behind, the ones that are faced out, is actually my research shelf. And as I'm writing, I tend to fill it up with books, and I often start out with like 1 or 2 books that I'm like, maybe this is what I'm writing about. This is the kind of novel I want to write. And every novel, I just fill it top to bottom as I go. And then I eventually dump it out, put it in boxes, that goes in the closet, and I start another novel. I require huge amounts of research as I'm writing, and do, of course, spend a lot of time just like reading and learning things, which is, to me, one of the joys of sort of writing novels. I mean, I feel like it's one of the ways I think best, is to do it in this way. So there's nothing wrong with doing a lot of research, of course. But yeah, I do know the anxiety of like researching and not writing at all. So of course, yeah.
Well, I want to come to your own process for writing this book. I noticed, in the book you'd mentioned that Scrivener is something you don't necessarily use for your novels, but you did use it for this book.
Right.
So the question I have, and I think somebody else asked that at some point already, but in terms of just tools, you use Word generally for your novels, but you've used Scrivener for this book. Was it for all 3 drafts, or how did you write this book? Was it 3 drafts as you have?
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of funny because I think I used the things in Refuse to Be Done to write Refuse to Be Done too, right? Like, all that last stuff we talked about, I did this book as well. I wrote the first draft in Scrivener, I think, and partly because it felt easy to outline there, right? So I should have put in all the sections I was going to write, and then I wrote them, and it was easy to move material in this book. I was like, oh, maybe this is really a first draft tactic, not a second draft tactic or something. I think for me, I think the Word thing is really just muscle memory. I've just like written for 20 years in Word, and it's just hard for me to write fiction in something else. Yeah. In the very, very end stages of writing a novel, when I'm working like long hours, I actually get like the white bands on the side of or the gray bands on the side of Word. I'll like see those when I'm walking around to get this like weird overexposure to Word. But I spent a lot of my life in Word. And so I think it's partly just memory. I also think there is something I like about scrolling through the book to get to the part of the book I'm working on, as opposed to working on things in discrete chunks. But I could absolutely see how the opposite could be true, that it might be really good to have things isolated and just to work on like that one chapter or that one scene. But I think, whatever tools work for people are good. I also think maybe I don't know how to use Scrivener very well. I think there's all these sort of tools there that I just don't know. And so it's partly not wanting to spend time learning it. The thing that's been most useful for me is using actually the note card view in Scrivener, which I sometimes use in that outline phase. I like the novel right now. When I got to my reverse outline, I did that in Scrivener. And that was super useful to write these like paragraph descriptions of scenes and be able to move them using the Scrivener tools. So I think Scrivener has been an interesting side part of my process, but most of it's just staring at that terrible Word display for hours and hours and hours.
Yeah. I think with Scrivener, I tried it. I think it's got a lot of bells and whistles, and so you end up kind of going into that. I use Notion now. Yeah, I use Notion, and I've kind of created my own process with Notion. My own.
Yeah, there are some people. Heard of that. I'll have to look it up.
Yeah. Notion. It's a to-do. It's a database, and people use it for all kinds of things. There are like Notion experts out there. So, anyways, but I'm coming back to. I think there was a question that Christy had about confidence, right? She was saying that it was the. Where's the question? I wrote it down. Where is the question?
I think
the process. Yeah, Christy asks. It seems like the process depends on your recognizing and being confident about your own taste and knowing what works. So how do you develop that confidence?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. There's sort of some of it is you just spend a lot of time with your own stuff, and you sort of, some of it stays like exciting for you and some of it doesn't. I think, if you're bored by something that you're reading in your own work, it's often because it's boring, not because you've seen it too many times. Like the exciting stuff stays good more often. There are days where you open up the document, everything looks terrible. And those are days you should not be judging yourself probably. But I think I can see the difference between my best prose, my worst. Actually, one of the odd tactics I suggest in the book is to go through like a chapter or maybe the whole book and highlight like your favorite parts of the book. And which you don't really have to do anything to them. You're just like finding the things you like the best, and you're using it to set the bar for the book, right? Where's the best scenes? Where's the best prose? And when the whole book's like that, then you'll be done. When my second novel, Scrapper, while I was writing it, I had a really hard time writing that book. And when I was writing it, there was this scene, it was like a half page long. It was just the two main characters in like a bar in downtown Detroit, like drinking and playing classic arcade games in the middle of the day. I just loved the feel of it. And I was like, when the whole book feels like this, I'll be done. And then at some point, like the whole book felt that good, you know, and I felt like that was really great. And when I got my edits from my editor, he had just drawn a big X through that paragraph, you know. And, you know, on one hand, I did not cut it from the book. I left it in the book. But at some ways, like I was like, maybe it did its work. It showed me how to write the book, and now I don't need it anymore. But I felt so much affection for its service that I left it in there. But I think like your own best work can show you what the bar is, and you sort of know when you're not there. And you know, similarly, when other people give you feedback, like Neil Gaiman has a thing where he talks about like if 5 people tell you something's wrong with your books, it's probably something wrong with it, you know. But like that their solutions are almost always wrong, and I think like that's the case too. Like you have to find your own solutions to what's not working, but you can believe people when you know, if everybody in your workshop is like, this isn't working, it's probably not, you know. If 2 people say that, you're probably fine. But yeah, you do sort of get better at trusting your own sort of instincts. And you will just get to know your own process better. Like I think even the things that go wrong in my process now, I'm like, this is just the part where this goes wrong. And I can move through it in a different way because I've been there before. Constantly,
You know,
yeah.
But you know, so related to this point about confidence, there's a couple of other things. One you mentioned in the book, and somebody asked this question as well, that 2.5 to 3 years is how much time you say it takes to write a book. And I kind of agree with that, because you've also got, it's not just that you're spending all the time writing the book. You talk about art time and live time, right? And with the live time, you know, you're obviously regenerating yourself as a person. You're reading. Absolutely. And I know you, for example, I follow you on Twitter, and you talk a lot about what you do in terms of your running, which is also a part of your, in a way, it's a part of your writing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, talk a little bit maybe about this art time versus live time, and how, when you say that it takes maybe 3 years to write a book, how maybe use this book as an example, you know, how did you separate the art time and live time? And
yeah, for whatever reason, I think all 3 of my novels took like 3.5 years or something from when I sort of started them to where I, you know, sent them to my agent or looking for an agent for the first one. But of course, it's not 3.5 years of like, I worked on it every day, right? It's sort of, you know, and there's other things in the process. I mentioned that my sort of ideal now is to write like 5 days a week for a couple hours at a time. And even that's not like every week, right? Because stuff comes up, or, you know, I have a busy week at school or something, but it's like an ideal. And so I'm, you know, I think that gets it done for me, sort of the process, but it does take a long time. I think like efficiency is not the goal. Like a great book is the goal, right? Like I sort of like, you know, I want the book to be the best it can be, and I don't mind that it takes that time. As you begin publishing books, the books that you have coming out will eat up your writing time in this kind of bizarre way. Like you send your book gets sent to a publisher, and then you have to do edits for it, and like the edits come in while you're drafting the next book, and so that builds some of that art time in, because I'm often moving between projects in that way. I don't usually write 2 things at once, right? Like I can't write 2 novels at a time. I basically stopped writing short stories because I'm writing novels. Like I can't do them both simultaneously, right? For me, at least. I know other people find it really easy to bounce back, but I like to immerse. And so that time is good. But the different phases of that time feel really different. I mean, you can see the way we talked about the 3rd draft today, that time feels very different than the 1st draft does. And so it doesn't feel sort of boring in a certain way to me. I mean, I think it's sort of each phase is interesting in its own way. And, you know, I mean, at one level, like also, I don't need to write a book every year. Like no one wants to read a book by me every year. You know, I think Refuse to Be Done is coming out like 9 months after Appleseed came out, and that's probably pushing people's patience, you know, listen to me promote books. So, you know, I think it's okay. But yeah, I don't think there's a right or wrong. Some people are very fast writers. Jesse Ball is one of my favorite writers, and he irritatingly writes books in like 2 weeks and doesn't do second drafts. His book that's coming out this fall, he wrote in a day, which makes me want to die. And it's really great. I just read it. It's fantastic. But like, I can't imagine, but you know, but I'm not Jesse Ball, and I don't have to worry about being Jesse Ball, because if I could do that, I would know by now. I can see just everybody's like shocked, angry faces. We'll get him. We'll get him one of these days. But you know, and it might take you 10 years, and you just, it's like, it's not, in some ways, like maybe this is the really important thing, that it's not a competition. And, I really think like the road to writer's block is like paved in comparison, like wishing you were somebody else, or wishing you're writing somebody else's kind of books, or having their kind of process, or even their kind of like freedom in their life to write, because we all have different sort of amounts of time in any given year or any given situation to work. The comparison is the thing that will make you crazy. You just have to sort of work your process through the book. Yeah.
You talk about how you can't write a novel and a short story at the same time. And I know some people have that where they can't do multiple projects, but I think some of us, I mean, for example, I'll do a translation project and my own novel project, because they're two very different things for me. But talk a bit about, some people have also said they can't read the same kind of genre or writer. So that, the anxiety of influence, if you like, right?
Right.
Do you how do you deal with that? Do you read you obviously do read a lot, because I see you recommending, you teach. So, how do you handle that anxiety of influence while you're in the middle of a project?
I don't know that I feel that anxious about influence. I feel like I kind of crave influence. Like, I really think one of the reasons I'm a writer is that it's just like loving books, right? Like I wanted to make things like the things I loved, so to read a sentence that makes you want to write a sentence like it is not the worst thing. Over the course of revision, it becomes your own, or else you take it out, right? You sort of be like, oh, this thing I copied from whoever is too much like them. But I think I want to be, in some ways, the work coming in helps get me out of my ruts, right? If I didn't read fiction, I don't know how I would write it. I do think it's good to read outside your genre. I think the reading that doesn't work when I'm writing a novel is when I'm like reading a book like to learn how to do something in my novel. Like I'm going to write like a science fiction book, like the science fiction book I'm writing, so I can learn how to do it. And then I'm not reading the book the right way. I'm reading it like, tell me how to do this, instead of like enjoying the story, right? So sometimes reading way outside my genre is really useful. And I think because of teaching and different things, I do read like really widely. My gut sense is that the writers who seem the most original are the widest read. That if you're reading outside of your era, outside of your own subjective sort of experience, you're reading across languages, across translation, across genres, it makes you a more interesting writer because you just have more influence to draw upon. The thing that doesn't work is when I'm trying to write something too one-to-one, right? It's like I want to write a book just like this book, and it's not complicated in some way. That's just imitation. That tends to fail. But yeah, if I couldn't read, I would quit writing if that was the thing, right? I would rather read than write. So I think they're really twinned for me, but I wouldn't, but everybody's again going to be sort of different in that way.
Let me go to a technical question again, which is somebody asked about tips on how to combine characters.
I think that's a great question. I really think I learned this from a novel writing student of mine. I had the first novel workshop I ever taught. A student had in a first draft, like a father and a son that were sort of like peripheral characters, but and at some point she was like, oh, they're playing the same role, like they have the same function. So I need to combine them into one person. And I was like, oh, are you gonna go back? What do you think you'll do? And she's like, I think I would just proceed as if I've already fixed it, so that I don't like lose momentum in the book. And so like at some point in the book, she just proceeded with the I think it was just the son stayed. And so like the son is now and all, doing that function in the book. And she's like, in revision, I will figure out how to, fix those scenes. But I thought that was really wise, that she just like acted as if she had already done the thing rather than go backwards. And I think about that a lot with all kinds of things where I'm like, oh, I've changed how I conceive something in the first third of the book. And rather than going back and rewriting the first third while I'm still drafting, I just like act as if I've done it, which is an interesting mental trick, but keeps you from, you're going to be constantly changing your mind about things as you write. So it keeps you from constantly restarting.
Yeah. Well, I know we're running out of time, so we'll take the last question here. And I kind of know what your answer is going to be to this one, Matt, because you actually tweeted about it last night. But I'm going to let you answer it because, not everybody follows you maybe, which is, and it's a book that you recommend a lot. But anyways, what is your advice to first-time writers who are looking for publishers and or literary agents?
Yeah, Jenny's referring to, I just talked about this yesterday, but Courtney Maum wrote this great book called Before and After the Book Deal, Maum, M-A-U-M. I really love that book. I actually just bought a stack of them to give to my graduating MFA students. Like, I just think it's like the best sort of description of the traditional publishing sort of path. And I think it's really great. If it's useful to have maybe one more thing so that something comes from me, I'll say that one thing I didn't know when I was first starting out that I think seems reasonably true is that your first agent and probably your first editor are likely to be around the same career stage as you. And sometimes that means age, but I really mean career stage. That new career, early career agents are more likely to take new clients. New career editors need more writers than sort of late careers who might be working with the same writers every year at that point. And so the most established editors take the least clients. You know, my agent and I have been, my agent and my first editors who did this book too, I've done 4 books with, are all within like 2 years of each other in age. And we all kind of, like, I published my first novel and they became agents and editors within like a 2 or 3 year period, right? We just kind of like, you know, I've been working with them for 10 years and we kind of came up together. And I know my agent doesn't take a lot of new clients anymore, right? Because he has the sort of people he's working with. And I think that is the case. So that you're some ways you're going to be looking, and this is actually one of the things Twitter is probably good for, is seeing like young agents and young editors sort of talk, but looking at publishers marketplace for who's buying what books. And I think really looking for people who are earlier in the career, who are working in the genre you're working in, are likely to be more receptive to you. There's an agent I really loved from when I worked in publishing that I sent my first novel, and she's like Rick Moody's agent and Purcell Everett's agent and all these people I really loved. And she wrote me back in 5 seconds to my query and was just like, "Oh, sweetie, I haven't taken a client in 20 years." You know, and I was like, because she had succeeded and she no longer needed to read new people's books, you know? And I think that was really instructive to me, and it helped me clarify maybe where to aim in that way. But yeah, read Courtney's book. It's great. Really warm and generous and smart.
Yeah, I mean, I got that book the year that my own came out, and I wish I'd read it a year ago, you know, because it's just full of practical advice. And so I second Matt's recommendation there. And with that, we'll come to a close here. If anyone does have questions, though, feel free to, you know, I mean, Matt's on Twitter. He's very open to answering. I hope it's okay to say that. But yeah, he's on Twitter. Follow him on Twitter and, you know, read the book. It's a great book. I've got so many bits highlighted. So thank you so much, Matt, first of all, for the book, which is amazing. And if, by the way, if you don't subscribe to Matt's newsletter, you should get that. That's how I found out about Matt. It's a great newsletter. It's on Substack, right, Matt?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's mattbell.substack.com. So easy to find. Yeah.
There you go. It's easy to find. Matt Bell on Substack.com, and he gives a lot of exercises in there. He gives a lot of great examples in there, books that he's reading, and examples of you know, just craft. So do subscribe, and the book is great. So thank you so much, Matt, for taking this time. We really appreciate it. I apologize again, I was a bit late, but thank you so much. This has all been terrific.
Thanks so much, Jenny, and thanks, Blake, and thanks everybody else for being here. Really a pleasure to get to talk with you all today. So have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.